She saved a life at 30,000 feet, but not before being handcuffed for trying. Dr. Maya Evans knew the woman was dying. She stood up to help, only to be tackled and restrained by an air marshal who didn't believe a black woman could be a doctor. But when the pilot collapsed mid-flight, the only person who could save him was the one in cuffs. What happened next would leave the entire plane and the world speechless. Dr. Maya Evans, a 34-year-old black woman with a sharp mind and years of medical expertise, sat quietly in seat 14A of the transatlantic flight from New York to London. Dressed in business casual attire, her long braids tucked neatly behind her ears, Maya was reviewing patient notes on her tablet, the hum of the plane's engines blending into the background. Her mind was focused, cataloging symptoms, treatments, and outcomes, the mental routine of a seasoned professional. A sudden, sharp sound, a panicked cough, cut through the cabin's muted atmosphere. "Ma'am, you need to stay in your seat." Maya's eyes snapped up. A white flight attendant stood in the aisle, her voice shrill with panic. A woman, pale, clutching her throat, stood a few rows ahead, her chest heaving as her mouth opened and closed, struggling to pull in air. Her eyes were wide with terror, tears pooling at the corners. Maya's body reacted before her mind fully processed it. Years of training and experience sharpened her instincts into immediate action. She unclasped her seatbelt and stood, moving toward the woman with swift, practiced calm. "I'm a doctor. Let me help," Maya said, her voice low but firm. Her eyes scanned the woman's flushed face and the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Blocked airway. Severe obstruction. Time was running out. A figure stepped into her path. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark uniform. His badge read, Air Marshal. His name tag, Officer Bradley. White. "Ma'am, sit down," Bradley ordered, his hand raised in a commanding gesture. Maya didn't flinch. She pulled her medical ID from her pocket and held it up. "I'm a doctor. She's choking. She needs immediate care." Bradley's gaze flicked down to the ID, then back to Maya's face. His eyes hardened, a thin smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "No way you're a doctor," he said flatly. His tone was low, condescending. Maya's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Bradley said, his voice laced with quiet malice. His stance widened as he squared his shoulders. "Get back in your seat, or I'll have you restrained." Maya's heartbeat thudded painfully in her chest. The woman's gasps were becoming weaker. Her lips were turning blue. "She's dying!" Maya stepped forward, her hand already reaching toward the woman's shoulder. Bradley's arm shot out, slamming against her chest. "Sit. Down." Maya's jaw tightened. "Move." Bradley's hand closed around her upper arm. "You're under arrest!" Passengers gasped. "What are you doing?" A woman's voice shouted from the back. Maya struggled, twisting in his grip. The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, cold metal biting into her skin. "You're interfering with flight crew operations," Bradley growled, twisting her arms behind her back and forcing her down into an empty seat. Maya's breath came fast and sharp. Her wrists burned where the cuffs dug into her skin. "She's choking," Maya screamed. "Let me help her." Bradley loomed over her. His face was an unmoving mask of quiet authority. "Stay out of it," he said coldly. Maya's chest heaved. The choking woman collapsed to her knees, her husband shouting her name, shaking her limp shoulders. The color was draining from her face. "Somebody help her!" a passenger yelled. "I can help her!" Maya screamed. "Shut up!" Bradley snapped. A young black man in a hoodie stood in the aisle, holding up his phone. He was recording. His face was twisted with outrage. "She's a doctor!" Passengers were shouting now. A woman started crying. A man leaned over his seat, yelling toward the flight attendant. "Let her help." "She's not a doctor," Bradley said, his tone hard and sure. "Sit down and stay quiet." Maya's heart slammed painfully against her ribs. Her hands were shaking. The woman on the floor let out a final weak gasp, and then her body stilled. A chilling silence swept through the cabin. The flight attendant knelt down, shaking. "She's not breathing." Maya jerked against the cuffs. "Let me help her." Bradley didn't move. "She's dying." Bradley's lip curled. "Actions have consequences." Maya's vision blurred with rage. Her breath hitched in her chest. The woman's husband was sobbing now, his forehead pressed against her hand. The young man with the phone stepped closer. "She's a doctor. You're going viral, dude." Bradley's eyes flicked toward the camera. His jaw twitched. For a split second, hesitation flashed across his face, but then his hand tightened around his belt. "Doctor needed in the cockpit!" The captain's strained voice crackled over the intercom. "We have a medical emergency. Doctor needed now." Maya's eyes widened. The flight attendant shot a panicked look at Bradley. "She's in handcuffs. Leave her," Bradley barked. "The captain is unconscious," passenger shouted. The flight attendant's hands were trembling. Her eyes darted toward Maya, then Bradley, then Maya again. "Get these off me," Maya shouted. Bradley hesitated. "Get these off." The flight attendant stepped toward Bradley. "Let her go. She's a threat. The pilot is going to die." Bradley's eyes darkened. Passengers were standing now. The shouting was growing louder. "Let her go. Uncuff her. Let her help." The flight attendant's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "If he dies, it's on you." Bradley's hand tightened on his belt. His mouth twitched. The young man with the phone stepped closer. "You're gonna be famous," he whispered. Bradley's jaw clenched. He pulled the key from his pocket. The handcuffs popped open. Maya rubbed her wrists as she stood. "Go," the flight attendant urged. Maya pushed past Bradley. His eyes burned into her back as she sprinted toward the front of the plane. And that was when everything changed. The cold steel of the handcuffs dug into Maya's wrists as Bradley forced her into an empty seat. Her heart hammered painfully against her ribs, adrenaline pumping through her veins. Her chest heaved as she struggled against the restraints, feeling the unforgiving metal bite into her skin. Panic surged through her, not for herself, but for the woman on the floor, whose face was now a sickly shade of blue. "She's dying!" Maya screamed, her voice cutting through the tense hum of the cabin. The choking woman's husband was kneeling beside her now, tears streaming down his face as he cradled her lifeless hand. His eyes were wild with desperation. "I am a doctor!" Maya shouted again, her voice raw. "Let me help her!" Bradley loomed over her, his face carved from stone, his mouth twisted into a mocking sneer. "What's the matter, huh? Didn't learn to obey authority?" Maya's eyes burned with tears of frustration. Her jaw tightened as she yanked against the cuffs, the metal cutting into her skin. "Please, let me help." Bradley's smirk deepened. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I don't care who you think you are. Sit there and shut up." Maya's breathing quickened. The woman's gasps were slowing. Her chest was barely rising. Seconds. They had seconds before this woman's brain would begin to shut down from lack of oxygen. The flight attendant, her face pale and stricken, turned toward the passengers and shouted, "Is anyone here a doctor?" Maya's heart thudded painfully. "I am," she screamed, jerking her arms upward. Bradley's hand shot down, pressing her wrists into her lap with bruising force. "Stay down!" "What are you doing?" a passenger shouted from across the aisle. The woman's husband sobbed as his wife's breathing slowed to a thin, ragged wheeze. His trembling hands clutched her face, helplessness radiating from every muscle in his body. "Please," he begged. "Somebody help her!" The flight attendant dropped to her knees and began chest compressions, incorrectly. Maya's heart seized. Her mouth opened in a strangled gasp as the attendant's hands landed too high on the woman's chest, failing to generate the force needed to restart the heart. "No, no, no!" Maya cried. She twisted violently in the seat, her muscles straining against the cuffs. "She's doing it wrong!" Bradley's hand tightened on her shoulder, shoving her back against the seat. His jaw clenched as his eyes blazed with quiet rage. "Sit down!" "You're killing her!" Maya screamed. Her voice was hoarse now, torn from desperation and fury. The woman's chest barely moved. Her lips were turning dark. The sound of her husband's broken sobs was like a knife to Maya's chest. Maya had spent her entire career saving lives. Countless hours in trauma wards, on-call shifts where she pushed herself to the brink, moments where seconds were the difference between life and death. And now she was forced to sit, powerless, while a woman died in front of her. And Bradley didn't care. Her chest heaved as her head swam with anger and helplessness. Her mind screamed at her to do something, anything. But the cuffs held fast, and then... Ding! A sharp chime from the intercom pierced through the noise of the cabin. "Doctor needed in the cockpit," the captain's strained voice crackled through the speaker. "We have a medical emergency involving the pilot." The flight attendant's head snapped toward Maya. Her wide eyes were filled with panic. "You're a doctor?" Maya's pulse thundered in her ears. "I told you I am!" The flight attendant spun toward Bradley. Her face twisted with anger. "Let her go!" Bradley's expression darkened. "No. We need a doctor now!" The captain's voice cracked over the intercom, frantic and urgent. Bradley's hesitation was a knife's edge of tension. His lips thinned into a harsh line as the flight attendant stepped toward him, fury flashing in her eyes. "Let her go!" she demanded. Bradley's eyes narrowed dangerously. His hand hovered over his holster. "She's a threat." "She's a doctor!" the young man with the phone shouted from the aisle. "She could have saved that woman!" Passengers were on their feet now, shouting, "Let her help! Uncuff her! She's a doctor!" The woman on the floor was completely still now. The sound of her husband's hollow sobs filled the cabin. The flight attendant's voice trembled with rage. "If the captain dies, it's on you." Bradley's hand twitched toward his belt. His mouth curled downward. "Let her go!" The young man with the phone stepped closer, raising the camera toward Bradley's face. His voice was deadly calm. "You're going viral, dude." Bradley's eyes flashed toward the camera. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He hesitated, only for a second, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the key. He knelt down beside Maya, his mouth twisted with quiet disdain as he unlocked the cuffs with a sharp click. Maya's breath tore from her lungs as the cuffs fell away. She yanked her hands forward and rubbed her wrists, red marks already forming where the steel had bitten into her skin. "Try anything," Bradley growled, his voice low and dark. "And you'll regret it." Maya's eyes snapped upward. Her gaze was like ice. "You already regret this." Bradley's jaw clenched. The flight attendant reached for Maya's arm. "Go!" Maya surged to her feet, adrenaline flooding her veins. Her limbs were trembling, but her mind was razor-sharp. Passengers parted as she sprinted toward the front of the plane, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Bradley's gaze burned into her back as she ran, and as she reached the narrow hallway leading to the cockpit, her fists clenched at her sides, breath cutting in short, shallow bursts. She didn't look back, and that was when everything changed. Maya entered the cockpit to find the co-pilot frantic. The narrow space was hot and stifling, the air thick with tension. The overhead panels blinked with frantic red and yellow lights. The co-pilot's hands were trembling over the controls, sweat beading down his forehead. The captain was slumped over in his seat, his head tilted to the side, mouth slightly open. His face was ashen, his chest frighteningly still. His breathing, if there was any, was too shallow to detect. Maya's pulse spiked as she dropped to her knees beside him. "He's in cardiac arrest!" Her voice was sharp and steady despite the chaos unraveling around her. "Defibrillator! Now!" The co-pilot spun toward the emergency compartment, yanking it open with clumsy, shaking hands. He fumbled with the case, nearly dropping it. Maya snatched the defibrillator from him and flipped it open in one smooth motion. Her hands moved with precision and purpose. Training and instinct kicked in, overriding the adrenaline pounding through her system. She tore the captain's shirt open, revealing his pale chest. His skin was slick with sweat, his lips starting to turn blue. She positioned the defibrillator pads carefully, pressing them against his chest. "Clear!" The co-pilot stepped back as Maya hit the button. A jolt of electricity surged through the captain's body, lifting his chest slightly off the seat before his body collapsed back against it. She watched the heart monitor. Flatline. "No pulse," Maya said, her voice sharp. Her jaw tightened. She adjusted the pads slightly, her hands steady despite the spike of panic pressing against her chest. "Again!" Another surge of electricity ripped through the captain's body. Her eyes locked on the heart monitor. A beat, a single, weak beep, then another. Her breath caught. The line on the monitor jumped and settled into a slow but steady rhythm. A pulse. "Come on," she whispered. The captain's eyelids fluttered. His chest rose and fell with a shallow breath. His eyes opened halfway, glassy and confused. "Captain, can you hear me?" Maya leaned closer, her hand resting on his shoulder. His eyes shifted toward her, weak but conscious. Relief hit her like a wave. "He's stable," Maya said, sitting back on her heels as her heartbeat slowed to something almost normal. The co-pilot let out a shaky breath and rubbed a hand over his face. "Jesus Christ." Maya pushed herself up and steadied her breath. Her muscles were taut with leftover adrenaline, but the relief washing through her body was undeniable. "You saved him," the co-pilot said, still catching his breath. "Yeah," Maya murmured. "I guess I did." A sound echoed through the narrow space, faint at first, but growing louder. Applause. Passengers were clapping, cheering. Maya stepped toward the cockpit door and pushed it open. The noise struck her immediately. Loud, emotional, charged with a mixture of relief and awe. The woman who had been choking was sitting upright now, clutching her husband's hand. Her face was still pale, but her breathing was steady. A fellow passenger, a middle-aged man with quick hands and a calm expression, had performed the Heimlich maneuver and was now sitting beside her, talking quietly. Passengers were standing in the aisles, clapping and murmuring. Some were crying, others were filming with their phones. Maya's eyes swept over the crowd until they landed on Bradley. He was standing at the front of the plane, arms crossed over his chest. His face was pale and strained. His jaw was set, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were wide with something dangerously close to shock. Maya's steps were slow and deliberate as she walked toward him. The flight attendant approached, her eyes glassy with lingering fear and awe. "You saved him." Maya's gaze never left Bradley. "And you almost let 2 people die," she said, her voice cutting and sharp. Bradley's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes flicked toward the woman who had nearly choked to death, toward her husband, whose face was still streaked with tears, then back toward Maya. The flight attendant stepped closer. "She told you she was a doctor." Bradley's mouth tightened. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He stood perfectly still, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Why didn't you let her help? The flight attendant pressed, her voice trembling with restrained anger. Bradley's mouth opened, his lips curled downward. I didn't think... Didn't think what? Maya's eyes narrowed. Her voice was cold and dangerous now. That a black woman could be a doctor? A murmur swept through the cabin. Passengers were watching now, phones raised, recording. Bradley's eyes flicked toward the nearest camera. His face tightened. I was doing my job, Bradley said stiffly. Maya took a step closer. No, you weren't. The young man with the phone, the one who had filmed the entire thing, raised his chin. You're trending, dude. Bradley's eyes narrowed. His chest rose and fell sharply as his hands curled tighter at his sides. Maya's eyes burned into his. Next time, she said softly, you should check your biases before someone dies. The flight attendant's mouth twitched with the ghost of a smile. Bradley's eyes darkened. His jaw was so tight it looked like his teeth might crack under the pressure. He inhaled through his nose, then turned sharply and walked toward the back of the plane without another word. Maya's gaze lingered on his back until he disappeared down the narrow aisle. A woman's voice broke the silence. Thank you. Maya turned to see the woman who had been choking standing now, her husband's arm wrapped protectively around her waist. Her eyes were red, but her smile was soft and warm. You saved my life, the woman whispered. Maya's throat tightened. I'm just glad you're okay. The woman stepped forward and hugged her. Maya's arms automatically lifted, wrapping around the woman's thin frame. Thank you, the woman whispered again, her breath warm against Maya's ear. When they pulled apart, the applause returned, louder this time. Maya smiled, but there was still steel in her spine, a hard edge beneath the warmth of relief. Because she knew this wasn't over. Bradley wouldn't forget this. Men like him never did. But that was a fight for another day. For now, Maya allowed herself to feel the relief, the quiet triumph, the knowledge that she had done what she was meant to do, save lives. And no one was ever going to stop her again. When the plane landed in London, 2 officers were waiting at the gate. The moment the wheels touched the ground, a hush fell over the cabin. The buzz of conversations and the lingering tension of the last few hours settled into a thick, heavy silence. Passengers turned toward the front of the plane as the flight attendants began opening the overhead compartments. But all eyes weren't on the luggage or the exits. They were on Bradley. Maya sat in her seat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Her pulse was steady now, her breathing calm, but her gaze was sharp and calculating as she watched the 2 uniformed officers step onto the plane. One was tall and broad-shouldered with close-cropped hair, his eyes scanning the cabin with quiet authority. The other was smaller, leaner, but his expression was hard. Both wore the no-nonsense expressions of men who had handled their fair share of problems. Bradley was standing near the cockpit door, his arms crossed over his chest. He was calm, too calm. His mouth curled into a knowing smirk as the officers approached. His eyes slid toward Maya with quiet malice. See? Bradley's voice was low and venomous as his gaze fixed on her. You're in trouble now. Maya's expression didn't shift. Her eyes remained cold and steady. Bradley stood taller as the officers reached him. He adjusted his belt, his stance widening into one of quiet dominance. His smile didn't waver. Can I help you, gentlemen? The taller officer's gaze sharpened. Officer Bradley? Bradley's smile deepened. Yeah? You're under arrest. The smirk disappeared. What? Bradley's brows furrowed. For unlawful restraint and racial discrimination, the officer said evenly as he reached for his handcuffs. The color drained from Bradley's face. His mouth twisted. What the hell are you talking about? I was doing my job. Passenger video tells a different story. The officer's chin lifted toward the young man standing near the aisle, phone still raised. The young man's expression was hard. His grip on the phone tightened. He took a step closer, angling the screen toward the officers. The bright glow of the recording was unmistakable. The sound of Bradley's voice, sharp and condescending, echoed faintly through the cabin's speakers. No way you're a doctor. Sit down or I'll have you restrained. You're under arrest. The officer's expression didn't change as the recording played. Bradley's mouth opened and closed. His gaze flicked toward the passengers, the faces turned toward him, the quiet hostility burning in their eyes. You can't be serious, Bradley hissed. His hand twitched toward his belt. This is a mistake. The officer's expression darkened. Hands where I can see them. You can't arrest me for doing my job, Bradley barked, his voice rising. She was interfering with flight operations. She was saving lives, the officer shot back. His hand closed around Bradley's arm. Turn around. This is bullshit! Bradley's voice cracked with outrage as the officer spun him around and yanked his arms behind his back. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed through the cabin. Passengers erupted into applause. The young man with the phone raised it higher, recording every second as Bradley's face flushed red. His mouth twisted as he struggled against the officer's grip. This is a mistake. I was doing my job. You have the right to remain silent. The officer began as he led Bradley toward the front of the plane. Bradley's feet dragged against the carpet. His face was twisted in disbelief and fury. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Maya stood slowly, her back straightened as Bradley passed by. His eyes caught hers, wild now, a dangerous mix of rage and disbelief swirling beneath the surface. Maya's gaze was steady and cold. Good, she thought. Let him feel this. This isn't over, Bradley hissed under his breath as the officer pushed him down the aisle. Maya's chin lifted slightly. No, she said softly. It's not. The officers led Bradley off the plane, his form disappearing into the jet bridge. The moment he was gone, the tension in the cabin broke like a snapped wire. Passengers erupted into louder applause. Some were whistling. A woman in the back shouted, "About time!" Maya's lips curled into a small smile. A figure stepped toward her, a young female reporter in a crisp navy suit, her press badge hanging around her neck. She had a phone in one hand and a microphone in the other. Dr. Evans, how do you feel about saving the captain's life? Maya's smile faded. Her eyes narrowed toward the door where Bradley had disappeared. I feel like justice was served, she said evenly. The reporter's eyebrows lifted slightly. Behind her, the crowd began moving down the aisle, filing toward the exits. The woman who had been choking earlier was leaning against her husband, smiling weakly. The man who had performed the Heimlich maneuver was helping them gather their luggage. And then, a small hand tugged at the sleeve of Maya's jacket. Maya turned to see a little girl standing there, no older than 7. Her dark curls were tied into neat braids, and her wide brown eyes were shining with admiration. My mom said you're a hero, the girl whispered. Maya's mouth softened. She crouched down so they were eye level. Tell your mom I'm just doing my job, Maya said gently. The girl smiled shyly. Then she reached into her pocket and held something out, a small, colorful rubber bracelet. For you? The girl whispered. Maya hesitated, then reached out and took the bracelet. It was simple. a mix of red and blue, slightly frayed at the edges. "Thank you," Maya whispered. The girl smiled wider, then ran back toward her mother. Maya turned the bracelet over in her hands as the girl disappeared into the crowd. A warmth settled in her chest, quiet and calm. The flight attendant approached. "Dr. Evans, thank you." Maya tucked the bracelet around her wrist. "Just doing my job." The crowd began thinning as passengers left the plane, but a few people lingered, watching Maya with quiet admiration. For the first time in a long time, Maya felt seen, not questioned, not doubted, seen. Her gaze drifted toward the open door of the plane. Beyond it, Bradley was gone. The weight of his authority, his dismissal of her identity, had been ripped away, exposed under the harsh light of truth. Justice had finally arrived, and Maya was ready for whatever came next.